Imagine a dusty town at the edge of nowhere. Ash Hollow, a speck on the plains where the wind whispers secrets and the sky watches like it knows something you don't. Picture a preacher, Elias Stone, standing in the fading light, his coat worn thin, a wooden cross swinging at his neck, his eyes haunted by a question that won't let him sleep. Why doesn't God, with all his infinite love, save every single soul? This isn't a gentle bedtime tale. It's a reckoning, a story that digs into the shadows of faith and the choices that split a town between light and dust. Meet Mara, who laughs at God over her whiskey. Jonah, chasing peace through beads and backroads. Clara, singing hymns with a heart cold as stone. Tobias, a preacher turned bitter by loss. Lydia, cursing Jesus with every breath. Samuel, gone too soon to a grave that won't answer. And Ruth, a mother who buried her faith with her son. 7 souls, 7 shadows, standing at a crossroads where grace waits. But not everyone takes it. The air is growing heavy in Ash Hollow, whispers of a coming fire, a trumpet's call, a day when the sky splits and choices turn to stone. This is the crossroads of grace, 5 chapters of a town teetering on the edge, a preacher fighting to save the lost, and a question for you. When the light breaks, where will you stand? Stick around. Things are about to get real. The sun dipped low over Ash Hollow, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gray, a bruised horizon that seemed to sag under its own weight. The town sprawled across a dry plain, a cluster of weathered shacks and crooked fences, where dust clung to everything: boots, porches, even the breath of the folks who called it home. Elias Stone trudged down the main street, his preacher's coat frayed at the cuffs, his boots kicking up little clouds with each step. At 43, he carried the look of a man who'd wrestled with more than just the wind, his face lined deep, his gray eyes shadowed by questions that gnawed at him in the quiet hours. Why doesn't God save everyone? The thought rattled in his skull like a loose stone, a puzzle he'd turned over 1,000 times since he'd first stood behind a pulpit. He believed in God's love, vast and endless as the plains stretching beyond Ash Hollow. But the edges of that love, where it met human hearts and found them cold, kept him awake at night. The wooden cross hanging around his neck swung gently as he walked, a reminder of the answer he preached, though it didn't always quiet the doubt. Ash Hollow wasn't much: a saloon, a general store, a chapel with a sagging roof. But it was his flock, and he'd spent years calling them to the light. Some listened, most didn't. Tonight, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with a stillness that pressed against his chest, as if the sky itself was watching, waiting. He passed the saloon, its doors creaking open, and Mara leaned out, her dark hair spilling over one shoulder, a smirk curling her lips. "Evening, preacher," she called, her voice sharp with mockery. "Gonna save my soul tonight?" Elias paused, meeting her gaze. She was the bartender, quick with a laugh and quicker with a barb. A woman who told him once she'd rather bet on the wind than a God she couldn't see. "There's still time, Mara," he said, his tone steady, though he felt the sting of her unbelief like a thorn in his side. She snorted, wiping her hands on her apron. "Keep your fairy tales, Elias. I'll take whiskey over prayers any day." She turned back inside, leaving the door swinging, and he stood there a moment, the cross warm against his skin, wondering how to reach a heart so firmly shut. Further down the street, Jonah sat on a crate outside the store, his weathered hat tipped low, his fingers tracing a string of beads he swore brought him peace. He drifted into town months ago, a wanderer with a patchwork faith, meditation, good deeds, a sprinkle of old gods, anything but Jesus. "Evening, Jonah," Elias said, stopping beside him. Jonah looked up, his eyes bright with a quiet certainty. "Preacher, you still think your cross is the only way?" Elias nodded, slow. "It's not my way, Jonah. It's his. Only one bridge to the Father." Jonah chuckled, shaking his head. "All rivers run to the same sea, Elias. I'll find my light my own way." He went back to his beads, and Elias walked on, the question burning hotter. Why wouldn't God sweep them all up, Mara and Jonah alike, if his love was so wide? At the chapel, he found Clara sweeping the steps, her Sunday dress spotless, her voice humming a hymn loud enough for the whole street to hear. She smiled when she saw him, all teeth and brightness. But Elias knew her heart didn't match the tune. She'd sit in the front pew every week, nodding at his sermons, then whisper venom about the town's poor behind their backs. Folks too ragged to tithe, she'd say. "Evening, Clara," he greeted, climbing the steps. "Keeping the Lord's house clean?" She beamed, brushing a stray hair from her face. "Always, preacher. Gotta look right for him, don't we?" Her words dripped with sweetness, but Elias saw the lie in her eyes, the hypocrisy that wore faith like a mask. He nodded, stepping inside, and let the door close behind him. The chapel was small, just a dozen pews and a rough-hewn pulpit, but it was his sanctuary. He sank onto a bench, staring at the wooden cross on the wall, its grain worn smooth by years of his touch. Mara's scoff, Jonah's beads, Clara's hollow smile, they circled in his mind, each a wall against the grace he preached. He opened his Bible, the pages soft under his fingers, and read aloud to the empty room. God desires all to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. All. The word stuck, heavy with promise, yet here he was, watching souls slip away. The cross loomed above him, Jesus' sacrifice etched in its lines, the blood that paid for every sin, every doubt, every turn back. Why then did they refuse it? He closed his eyes, letting the silence settle, and felt the weight of their choices, the freedom God gave them to walk away. A gust rattled the windows, sharp and sudden, pulling him from his thoughts. He stepped outside, the wind colder now, carrying whispers from the edge of town. Rumors of a reckoning, a day of fire drawing near. Folks had been talking, uneasy, about signs in the sky, dreams of trumpets. Elias looked up, the stars faint against the gathering dark, and felt a chill that wasn't just the night. Time was short, shorter than they knew, and Ash Hollow stood at a crossroads. Grace offered, but not forced. He gripped the cross at his neck, its edges biting into his palm, and resolved to call them once more, before the light broke and the dust turned to ash. The sun climbed slow over Ash Hollow, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, but the light felt dim, as if strained through a veil of unease. Elias Stone rose early, his bones aching from a restless night, his mind still tangled with the faces of Mara, Jonah, and Clara, souls adrift, each in their own way, from the grace he preached. He pulled on his coat, the cross at his neck a steady weight, and stepped out into the morning chill, determined to seek out more of the lost before the whispers of reckoning grew louder. The town stirred around him, folks hauling water, tending chickens, their voices low, their eyes darting to the sky now and then, as if they felt it too, the ticking of some unseen clock. He headed toward the edge of Ash Hollow, where the shacks thinned and the plains stretched wide, to a place he hadn't visited in months. A crumbling shed where Tobias lived, a man who'd once stood shoulder to shoulder with him in faith. Tobias had been a preacher too, his voice bold, his hands quick to help, until tragedy struck. His wife, Sarah, taken by a fever 2 summers back, leaving him hollow. Elias knocked on the sagging door, the wood creaking under his fist, and Tobias opened it slow, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken like wells run dry. "What do you want, Elias?" he rasped, his voice a shadow of its old fire. "Come to drag me back to your God?" Elias stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the sour tang of neglect, broken crosses littering the floor like fallen soldiers. "I came to talk, Tobias," he said, keeping his tone even. "You knew the truth once. You preached it. What changed?" Tobias laughed, a bitter sound, and kicked a shard of wood across the room. "What changed?" "She died, Elias. I prayed, I begged, and he let her go. If that's your God's love, I want no part of it." Elias felt the words like a blow, but he held steady, pointing to the cross at his chest. "He gave us everything on that cross, Tobias. Even when we don't understand, it's still true." Tobias turned away, his shoulders hunched. "Keep your cross. I'm done with it. Done with him." Elias left the shack, the door slamming behind him, and stood in the wind. his heart heavy with the apostate's rejection. Another soul lost, not to ignorance, but to a wound too deep to heal. Midday found him in the town square, the sun high but cold. When Lydia stumbled from the saloon, her steps uneven, her laughter loud and jagged. She was a fixture in Ash Hollow, a woman who'd once worked the fields, but now drowned her days in whiskey, her tongue sharp as a blade. She spotted Elias and grinned, a wild, mocking thing. "Preacher man, come to save me too?" she slurred, staggering closer. He nodded, calm despite the stench of liquor on her breath. "Always, Lydia. Jesus offers a way out." Her grin twisted into a sneer, and she spat on the ground, her voice rising. "Jesus? That liar? If he's so great, why's my life a pile of dirt? To hell with him." The blasphemy cut through the square, heads turning, folks pausing with buckets and brooms, and Elias felt a flare of anger. Hot, quick, but he swallowed it, his hand tightening on the cross. "He loves you, Lydia," he said, soft but firm. "Even now." She laughed again, a cackle that echoed off the buildings, and lurched back toward the saloon, leaving him standing there, her words a poison he couldn't unhear. The square emptied as the afternoon wore on, and Elias sat on a bench, his Bible open in his lap, the pages rustling in the breeze. He read again. God's desire for all to be saved, the promise of grace through the cross, and looked up at the sky, now tinged with gray, clouds rolling in from the west. Tobias's bitterness, Lydia's curses, they were choices he knew, walls built high against the love that waited. Free will, the gift that let them turn away, even when it broke God's heart. He thought of the cross, the nails, the blood, Jesus dying for every soul, even those who spat in his face, and felt the weight of it, the mystery of a love so vast yet refused. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters of the general store, and a murmur ran through the town. More talk of signs, of a day coming swift and unannounced. Elias closed his Bible, his fingers tracing its worn cover, and stood, resolve hardening in his chest. He'd seen the unbeliever in Mara, the seeker in Jonah, the hypocrite in Clara, and now the apostate in Tobias, the blasphemer in Lydia. 5 shadows cast across the path to salvation, each a warning. Night fell, and he lay in his small room behind the chapel, the lantern flickering when sleep took him hard. He dreamed of a horizon swallowed black, a trumpet's call piercing the dark, and woke with a start, sweat beading his brow. The reckoning, the rapture some called it, felt closer, a shadow creeping over Ash Hollow, and he knew time was slipping through his fingers. He had to reach them, had to try, before the sky split and the choices they'd made became stone. The morning broke gray over Ash Hollow, clouds thick and low, muffling the sun's warmth as Elias Stone stepped out from his chapel, his breath fogging in the crisp air. The town hummed with its usual rhythm, horses clopping down the street, a hammer ringing against nails at the blacksmith's. But beneath it all lay a tension, a quiet unease that had settled since the whispers of a reckoning began. Elias carried his Bible under one arm, the cross at his neck glinting faintly, and walked past the shacks toward the edge of town, where the plain opened wide and a lone grave stood beneath a twisted oak. Samuel's grave. The name carved into the weathered stone stirred a pang in Elias's chest, sharp and old, a wound that never quite healed. Samuel had been his friend, a lanky man with a quick grin and a laugh that could fill a room, a carpenter who'd built half the pews in the chapel. He'd lived for the day, whiskey on weekends, jokes swapped over a fire, brushing off Elias's talks of faith with a wave and a wink. "Plenty of time for that, preacher," he'd say, until a fever swept through Ash Hollow 2 winters back, fast and merciless, stealing him before Elias could say more. Elias knelt by the grave, the dirt cold under his knees, and traced the letters with a calloused finger. Samuel Tate, 1832 to 1870. Too young, too soon. He'd tried that last night, sitting by Samuel's cot as the man burned hot, his breath rattling, offering words of Jesus, of the cross, of grace waiting. Samuel had only smiled, weak, and murmured, Not now, Elias, before slipping away. The memory clawed at him. Those missed chances, the sermons he could have pressed harder, the truth he'd let slide. He stood, the wind tugging at his coat, and looked out over the plain, vast and empty, feeling the finality of death like a stone in his gut. The deceased, those who'd run out of time, haunted him now, a shadow on his mission to reach the living. Back in town, Elias gathered a small crowd outside the general store. Folks pausing with sacks of flour or buckets of water, their faces a mix of curiosity and wariness. He climbed onto a crate, Bible in hand, and raised his voice over the wind. "The cross," he began, "is the bridge, the only way to the Father. Jesus hung there for every one of us. His blood paid it all." Some nodded. Widow Grace, her shawl tight around her shoulders. Tom, the blacksmith's boy, his eyes bright with youth. But others turned away, muttering. "Heard it before, preacher," a man called, spitting tobacco into the dust. "Ain't no proof." Elias held up the cross from his neck, its wood worn smooth. "Proof's in the promise. He wants you saved, but you've got to cross it." The words hung there, heavy, and he saw Samuel's face in his mind, a reminder of those who'd never stepped forward. The crowd drifted off, some lingering to whisper about the strange weather, the rumors of a day coming swift, and Elias felt the divide, faith pulling some, doubt holding others fast. By noon, the sky darkened further, thunder rumbling in the distance, and Elias walked the streets, watching Ash Hollow's people move through their lives. He passed Mara at the saloon, her smirk gone, her eyes on the clouds, and Jonah by the store, his beads still in hand but his brow furrowed. Clara swept her porch, humming loud, her mask of piety unshaken, while Tobias's shack stayed dark, Lydia's laughter echoing from the bar. Each a soul he'd tried to reach, each a wall he couldn't breach, and Samuel's grave loomed in his thoughts. The sixth type, the departed, a warning of what waited if he failed. The storm grew closer, wind whipping dust into swirls, and folks gathered under awnings, their voices rising, talk of signs, of dreams, of a fire in the sky. Elias stopped at the chapel, stepping inside to escape the gusts, and sank onto a pew, the cross on the wall staring down. He opened his Bible, flipping to Hebrews. "It is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment." And let the words sink in, heavy as the thunder outside. Samuel was gone, his chance spent, and Elias felt the weight of that truth. The cross stood open, but only the living could take it. He'd preached it 100 times, but now, with the town teetering on the edge of something big, it hit harder. The storm broke as evening fell, rain hammering the roof, lightning flashing through the windows, and Elias stood at the pulpit, looking out at the empty seats. He pictured Samuel there, grinning, then gone, and the others, Mara, Jonah, Clara, Tobias, Lydia, still here, still choosing. The thunder rolled, a deep growl that shook the walls, and he gripped the Bible tight, feeling the urgency swell. Time was short, the signs were clear, and Ash Hollow stood at a precipice. Grace offered, but not forever. He whispered a prayer, voice lost in the storm, asking strength to call them one more time before the sky opened and the departed became the damned. The rain lingered into morning, a steady drizzle that turned Ash Hollow's streets to mud, softening the edges of the town but not its growing unease. Elias Stone woke with the storm's echo in his ears, the chapel roof still dripping, his dream of a trumpet's call sharp in his mind. He pulled on his coat, the cross at his neck cold against his skin, and stepped out into the damp air, his boots sinking as he headed toward a house on the town's edge, a place he'd avoided too long. Ruth lived there, a woman who'd once been a pillar in his flock, her voice lifting hymns with a strength that filled the chapel, her young son Caleb always at her side. That was before the accident, a runaway wagon, a scream, and a boy gone in an instant, leaving Ruth broken. Elias knocked on her door, the wood warped and gray, and she opened it slow, her face thin, her eyes hard as flint. "What do you want, Elias?" she said, her voice flat, no trace of the warmth he'd known. He stepped inside, the room dim, a single candle flickering on a table strewn with dust and untouched dishes. "I came to see you, Ruth," he said, keeping his tone gentle. "It's been a while." She turned away, staring at a small pair of boots by the hearth, Caleb's untouched since that day. "No point in it," she muttered. "God took him, took everything. I don't need your sermons." Elias felt the ache of her words, the bitterness that had rooted where faith once grew, and he touched the cross at his chest. "He didn't take Caleb to hurt you, Ruth. Jesus wept for us on that cross. He knows your pain." She spun, her eyes flashing. "Don't talk to me about his tears. Where was he when my boy died? I believed once, Elias, and it got me nothing but ash." Her voice broke, and she sank into a chair, hands trembling, a soul turned away, the seventh shadow on the path to grace. Elias knelt beside her, searching for words, but she waved him off, her face a wall he couldn't climb. He left the house, the drizzle soaking his coat, and walked back toward town. Ruth's rejection heavy on his shoulders. Another lost, not to doubt or scorn, but to a grief that drowned her faith. By midday, the rain eased, and Elias found a different scene at the chapel. A handful of folks gathered, their faces lit with something new. Widow Grace stood at the door, her shawl damp but her smile firm, offering him a basket of bread. "For the meeting, preacher," she said, her voice steady. Tom, the blacksmith's boy, carried a stack of firewood, his grin wide, while others, old Ben, Sarah from the store, brought blankets, jars of preserves, a quiet strength in their steps. Elias stepped inside, the pews half full, and felt a spark of hope. These were the faithful, the ones who'd heard his call and clung to it. He stood at the pulpit, Bible open, and spoke clear. "Faith ain't a show, folks. It's not loud words or Sunday clothes. It's a life walk true, rooted in the cross. Jesus gave it all, and we've got to live it every day till he comes." They nodded, Grace whispering an amen, Tom stacking the wood with care, and Elias saw it. A community forming, small but real, readying their hearts for what loomed near. He taught them from Scripture, love your neighbor, forgive, hold fast, and they shared what they had, a meal of bread and soup, their voices rising in a hymn that pushed back the gray. Outside, the town split. Mara served drinks with a scowl, Jonah fingered his beads by the store, Clara swept her porch with a hum, Tobias stayed shut in, Lydia laughed loud from the saloon. Ruth hid in her dark house, but here in the chapel, faith took root, a light against the shadows. Night fell, the sky clearing to stars, and Elias sat alone after the others left, the chapel quiet, save for the creak of the roof. He closed his eyes, the cross warm in his hand, and a vision gripped him, a figure in white, tall and still, standing at the edge of Ash Hollow, voice like a river over stones. "Stand watch," it said, calm but firm, and Elias felt it deep, the rapture, the day of fire, closer now, splitting the town between the fallen and the faithful. He opened his eyes, the candle's flame steady, and saw Ruth's face, her son's boots, then Grace's bread, Tom's grin, a war of choices playing out before him. He'd tried with Ruth, failed, but here were others, holding to the cross, living it true, and he knew his call, to stand watch, to gather who he could before the sky broke open. The stars outside shone cold, the wind whispering through the cracks, and Elias resolved to keep preaching, keep reaching for the seventh type. Those who'd turned away still lingered, and the faithful needed strength for what came next. Dawn crept over Ash Hollow, a pale glow threading through the low clouds, but the air hung thick, charged with a stillness that prickled the skin. Elias Stone stood outside the chapel, his coat dusted with morning dew, the cross at his neck glinting faintly as he watched the town wake slow, smoke curling from chimneys, a rooster crowing sharp, folks stepping out with buckets and axes, their movements heavy as if they sensed the weight pressing down. He'd spent the night in prayer, the vision of the figure in white, stand watch, echoing in his bones, a call he couldn't shake. The faithful had gathered again yesterday, Grace with her bread, Tom with his firewood, their voices soft but firm, readying themselves for what Elias knew was near, the rapture, the day of fire, the reckoning whispered about in dreams and signs. He'd seen the seven shadows, Mara's unbelief, Jonah's other paths, Clara's hypocrisy, Tobias's apostasy, Lydia's blasphemy, Samuel's death, Ruth's turning away, and felt the urgency to call them one last time, but the sky had other plans. It began with a hum, low and deep, a vibration that rattled the chapel windows and set the dogs howling down the street. Elias turned his eyes upward, the clouds parting slow, and then it came, a light, blinding, pure, bursting from the heavens like a star torn open, flooding Ash Hollow in white. A trumpet blasted, sharp and piercing, splitting the air, the sound rolling over the plain like thunder without end. And Elias felt his feet lift, a pull gentle but unyielding, his body rising as the world below blurred. He looked down, heart pounding, and saw them, the faithful vanishing in flashes, Grace gone from her porch, Tom lifted mid-step, old Ben and Sarah snatched from the store, their forms fading into the light. A harvest reaped swift. But the others remained, rooted to the earth, and Elias saw their faces clear. Mara stumbling from the saloon, her bottle crashing to the boards, her voice a curse at the sky, unbelief locking her in place. Jonah clutching his beads, eyes wide, chanting frantic as his paths led nowhere. Clara on her knees, tears streaking her face, her hymns hollow now, hypocrisy exposed. Tobias standing still outside his shack, staring blank, his rejection a chain. Lydia screaming from the square, her blasphemy a noose tightening with every word. Ruth peering from her window, hands over her ears, her bitterness a wall unbreached. Samuel's grave lay silent, the departed beyond reach, and Elias felt the sting of each loss, a gallery of choices made and unmade, shadows against the cross he'd preached. The light held him, warm and vast, and he rose higher, Ash Hollow shrinking below. A town split, the faithful gone, the left behind reeling. Chaos erupted in the streets, folks running, shouting, some falling to their knees as the truth hit hard. Too late, too late. The grace offered, refused, now withdrawn. Mara pounded the saloon wall, her curses turning to sobs. Jonah dropped his beads, hands clawing the dirt. Clara wailed for mercy she'd never shown. Tobias sank to the ground. Lydia raged at the empty sky. Ruth hid her face, and the rest stumbled blind. Fear and regret a tide swallowing them whole. Elias looked away, the cross at his neck burning bright, and saw it clear. God's love, infinite, poured out on that cross, a bridge for all, but not all crossed it. The seven types stood as warnings, their choices stone, and he felt no triumph, only sorrow for the lost, mingled with peace for the found. The light grew, swallowing the plain, and Elias heard voices. Grace, Tom, the faithful, singing soft, a hymn of home, and he knew he'd stood watch till the end. The vision faded, the rapture complete, and he was gone, leaving Ash Hollow to its dust and echoes. But the story lingered, a call ringing out beyond the page, beyond the screen. Check your heart, it said. Look to Jesus. The cross stands open still, for now. Elias had seen the shadows, Mara's scoff, Jonah's beads, Clara's mask, Tobias's wound, Lydia's venom, Samuel's silence, Ruth's despair, and preached the light, the only way, the blood that paid it all. The faithful held fast, lived true, built a circle of grace, and when the trumpet sounded, they rose. The left behind faced the truth too late, their choices a mirror for the living. Time runs short, the call pressed. Find him, stand with others, for the day comes unannounced, a thief in the night. Elias's voice faded into the light, but one question hung back, sharp and quiet, for every soul still breathing. Where will you stand when the sky falls silent? The town was ash and memory now, the rapture passed, but the echo remained, a whisper to the watcher, the listener. You're here, the cross is near. What will you choose? Tell me below. Share your thoughts, your faith, your doubts. And if this stirred you, hit that like, subscribe for more. The day's coming and the choice is yours.